Now I'm going to talk about the dogs, the sheep dogs, the working dogs at Mount White. There were 6 musterers at Mount White when I was there. Well, there was 5 musterers and the manager, who was a working musterer anyway. And six musterers, and they would have something like 5 or 6 dogs each. So at any one time around those camps out the back of Mount White, there could be 25 or 30, 35 dogs, all colours, all sizes, all different natures, all knew everything, all running around and putting on a big act. But they were very good, hard-working dogs, because Mount White was a hard, tough place to muster. And the dogs had to be good. You couldn't, there was no room for passengers or pets up there. If you had a dog, if a dog couldn't do what he was supposed to do at Mount White, she was boot hill. And so the dogs that were there, they did a marvellous job out on the hill each and every day. And in the autumn, I mean in the summertime, those dogs were in those big basins, it was hot as hell, and those dogs would punch into it and they would do the work that they were required to do. In the autumn, snow and cold and awful conditions, and those dogs would do it each and every day quite faithfully. They'd come back to the hut with the musterers at night, and they'd tie them up under a matagari bush somewhere, and they'd curl up and they'd get a feed every second day. And those dogs, they were faithful beggars, and there's never enough talked about the high country about how valuable dogs are to the ordinary fellow in the street. I mean, musterers knew how good they were, but if you say to people, oh, these fellas had dogs up in the back country, that's, oh yeah, go on then. But they were wonderful dogs, and they did a great job. And so it's worthwhile me mentioning the importance of the dogs at Mount White, because without the dogs and the horses, you might as well forget it. I'm going to now talk a little bit about the dogs that worked at Mount White with the musterers. I have mentioned before about how important the dogs were, and some of these pictures that you'll see show the dogs with the musterers up in the top of the mountains and doing the job that they were expected to do every day. These dogs were tough, well-bred, good dogs to do the work that they had to do. And I've seen dogs come off the hill at the end of the day, no skin on their feet, their little pads all worn off, but they'd have a feed, curl up under a matagari bush, and at 2 or 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning they'd punch into it again. This shows a picture of the dogs at dosing time at Mount White that was done every year, checking on the high datids that was supposed to have existed in those days. Mount White, of course, always come up with a clean bill of health. The wee dogs were faithful. They went out in all weathers, snow, hot weather, creeks, matagari, rocks, boulders, the whole shooting box. And the dogs did it because they liked to do it. When you see a muster in these pictures, you'll always see his dogs, because they were faithful, they hung about, they did what they were told, and they were under very good discipline. There were a lot of good dogs that were broken in at Mount White, and some of them went forward. In fact, one good, very good dog from Mount White, it won the New Zealand Zigzag Championship in the Hunterway class some years ago. So that was a feather in the cap for Mount White, and it gave the other musterers at Mount White some sort of an incentive to perhaps repeat that performance at the dog trials. The musterers at Mount White normally had about 5 or 6 dogs following them, and they roughly worked out at 2 or 3 hunterways, 2 or 3 handy dogs, and a good heading dog. And of course, the hunterways, quite clearly, they would hunt the sheep away and down. Heading dogs, they would head the sheep off if they were trying to break and get over the top of the hill or venture where they shouldn't be going. And the wee handy dogs, they were used for doing all those sorts of things around the yards at drafting times, working on the cattle, and by the name they were handy. They could do most things. They were like a sort of a DIY fellow, you know, you could do a bit of this and a bit of that, and they were very invaluable at a place like Mount White because they could be used to spell the good working dogs, and that's how they operated. Now these wee dogs used to get fed once every 2 days, and a carcass, a dog tucker, would feed around about 10 to 12 dogs. They'd get a good big chunk of meat and they would get that into them, and that was enough to keep these dogs fit to be able to do the work that they did at Mount White. I've tried to work out how far a good working dog on the hill at Mount White would have covered in a normal day on the hill at Mount White. And I wouldn't be too far out if I said that heading dogs and hunt-away dogs would cover approximately 40 to 50 kilometres in a day. That might sound a bit stretching it a wee bit, but the big days at Mount White, the musters on the hill for 4, 5, 6 hours, that's what I would estimate that those little dogs would do. As I mentioned previously, Mount White used to run 14, 15, 16,000 sheep. And one of the difficulties with some of the movements of sheep on Mount White Station was getting them across the rivers. Because putting sheep across any river at any time is always a difficult job. It's a dangerous job. Unless people know what they're doing, sheep can get into a river, they get their wool all saturated with water, the next thing they sit up on their back and they float downstream, and within 10 or 15 seconds you've got 40, 50, even 100 dead sheep. And so putting the little hobbits across onto bottom packing Mount White was always a job that you had to be very, very careful about because they were small and younger sheep and not many brains and so on. And putting them across the east was a difficult job, but we tried different things with old dray axles with some 4x2 up it and a bit of 6x1 nail on it, and all bits and pieces. Pretty Mickey Mouse when you come to think about it, but you had to try because, as I say, it was a basic place. You couldn't just ring up and say, oh, we'll get some, do this and do that and get this transported up there. And so we tried all sorts of things to get these little fellas across, and in later times, as times got better and Mount White had a few more quid to chuck around and so forth, they had tractors and trailers and all sorts of things. And they came up with an idea that we actually tried back in the late 50s to get these hobbits across, and it's with like a movable bridge or a mobile bridge on wheels, and you unfolded it and put it across the streams and put some wings up and put the little hobbits in there, and you could dog them across, and once they started to run, they went across quite nicely, and this sort of more or less solved the problem with getting hobbits across the river. And so these pictures you'll see shortly just show you perhaps how difficult it was, but at the end how easy it was. Yeah. I'm going to talk now very briefly about the sheep at Mount White that were responsible for generating the income that allowed Mount White to operate. I can't say a whole lot about these pictures that you're going to see going past, and I'll just briefly make some comment here and there, anything that of note that I think is worthy of talking about. You see pictures here of sheep in the shearing muster being brought in from out the back of Mount White. Big mob of sheep. This picture here of 8,000 or 9,000 wethers being brought in by the musterers, and they used to go through little bits of creeks and swamp and all this sort of carry on until they were accumulated into a big large mob, and they could then be herded up and sent on their way to Mount White for the shearing that took place in around about the 2nd or 3rd week of January. These are a few stragglers that were brought off the hill in the autumn. They'd been missed on the first muster, and they used to call it, they were scratch, do a scratch muster to pick up the odds and sods that they didn't get the first time round. There were big shingle slides and big faces here that the musters had to go through, and this is a nice picture of one of the musters heading through one of the big shingle slides. This is looking down the Esk. This shows you the rugged country that these people had to bring the sheep down through in all conditions. Crossing the wee rivers was, as I've mentioned before, was difficult, but if you got adult sheep to run through the water and strung them out, not too thick, you didn't have a great lot of difficulty. Getting sheep off the snow, of course, in the autumn was a wee bit different. Different conditions, icy, cold, and so forth, and that was a little bit different than in the summertime when conditions allowed more freedom for the dogs and the people and so on. This is the snow country at the back of Mount White, and these pictures were taken in the autumn, catching a few sheep here and bundling them up and getting them into a mob so that you got enough to punch them down off those hills down onto the flat in preparation for bringing them into the homestead. Around the sheep yards, of course, there were little dogs there that are called wee backing dogs, and they'd run over the backs of the sheep and frighten the sheep a bit, and consequently the sheep would run down the races in preparation for the drafting and the dipping and the shearing and stuff like that, and they were very, very invaluable. This is a sheep that was brought in by the musters. It was a straggler, didn't belong to Mount White, and they nursed the sheep in, and it had a huge amount of wool on it. The silver eaten here is a picture of the same sheep. When the wool was knocked off the sheep, it was about 24 inches long. That was quite a thing to see, with the sheep that had come in all the way from the top end of the Packety range and made it all the way back into the station. Mob of sheep that was coming in from out the back, the shearing muster, and as you see in this next little picture, sheep going across a little wee tiny creek out the back, and they ran across quite nicely because they were adult sheep, not like the little hobbits I talked about at the Esk. And we're getting down towards the Esk River now, and we're going to cross the sheep across the Esk, and you'll see by the depth of the water on some of these sheep, which I spoke about earlier, couldn't be too deep. Sheep would lose their footing and head over heels and downstream, get caught in a bluff somewhere, and that was good night Irene. But with a bit of careful manoeuvring and a bit of good shepherding, these little sheep used to be put across without a great, well, with difficulty, but if you were careful and not a bull at the gate doing the job, you'd get the job done. And of course, I've spoken before about the Heath Robinson outfit that we tried to do to put the hobbits across the Esk on a number of occasions, and it was a complete failure. You'd fall in the river and you get wet, start swearing, putting on a net. And these are the little old dray wheels that were some of the first of the start with a bit of 3x2 and 6x1, absolute hopeless. And then they come along with this idea of making this movable bridge that folded out, and this was an excellent idea. Run it into the river with a tractor, unfold it like a big hinge it was, and drop it across the deep water, put a few wings up, dog the sheep into the wings, and once you got them started running across this little bridge, they would go across quite happily, and you did it without any fatalities or any drownings, and that made everybody happy. When the sheep were down in the wool shed and had been shorn and they were ready for dipping and so
so forth, they had to be drafted off. The old ones were sent to the freezing works and sort the sheep out, and they had a drafting race and they would draft them off. And then of course at the beginning of the season, when the ewes had the lambs, there was a tailing took place, 3 or 4 places around the farm, and you get the little lambs and mark them, tail them. And these were pictures of the boys in the tailing yards. These are some very nice pictures of out the back, out Loppinbar main range, of the sheep being mustered off the hills and down into these gullies, and all being assembled and getting in preparation for the 4 or 5 days trip back into Mount White. And there's a little sheep here that he's been caught in the snow, and he's living in a wee snow cave there, and he's not overly happy, but at least he survived and he made the trip back to the station. And finally we've got this lovely little picture of the horse, sheep, dogs, and that's just a little bit of a rundown on the sheep situation.
I'm going to talk now briefly about the transport for goods and stuff at Mount White. In the early days, going back in the before 1920 and round about the 20s, all of the transport, all of the gear that was taken in and out of Mount White, particularly the wool, was done with horse and wagon. And given that Mount White, in some of those early years, saw something like 40,000 sheep, it used to produce about 700 bales of wool, and that would take power of carting out of Mount White under any condition. And also, given the fact that this wool was scoured on the property to wash the sand and the grit and the shingle and stuff out of the wool, made it that much lighter to cart out of the place. And it was carted out of Mount White by a team of people, the Milliken brothers, who are still up in that area, around the Springfield area, well-known people for horses and big wagons and stuff like that, and they carted all the wool out over the Waimakariri River and to the siding at Cass, where it was transshipped to Christchurch or Timaru or wherever. But on the odd occasion, Milliken brothers took all of the wool from Mount White all the way to Christchurch. The time it took to take all of the wool to Christchurch, I understand, exceeded 2 months. You can imagine taking a wagon load of wool down and bringing stores and corrugated iron and bits and pieces that needed all the way back to Mount White. Now when I went to Mount White, all the transport facilities there consisted of about a 3-ton Bedford truck and a little old Model A little Ute type truck that's very, very reliable. And that was used to cart the wool out after the Millikens had given up carting, and I used to take the wool out to Cass each day during the shearing season. 12 bales at a time, sometimes 3 trips a day, and it would be loaded onto LA wagons and it would be shipped into Timaru. In later times, as the roads got better, there was bigger trucks, transport firms popped up here, there and yonder. It was much more economic to get a big truck in, trailer, put all of the wool on it, and one fell swoop, get all the wool off Mount White, almost with perhaps 1 or 1.5 or 2 trips in and out of Mount White. And so, as times changed, so did the business of transportation. The horses had gone, and the big heavy trucks and trailers, they came in and took over. And so that's just a change from when I was there until the present time, when big trucks go into Mount White, back up to the stockyards, they put all the bullocks and stuff like that, and sheep and these big trucks, disappear over the horizon, away and gone, and that's what they call progress. The only form of transport at Mount White 100 years ago was by horse and wagon. And this shows a picture of a wagon load of wool taken at the Cass railway station about 1907. This shows how the wool was carted out of the back country of New Zealand all those years ago. This little trap was used at Mount White to take the few stores out to Nigger Hill, to where the boundary riders were living in a little cottage in about the early to mid 30s. This is an old Model A ute that was at Mount White, very, very reliable, could go out to Cass in the snow and through the creeks, had narrow tyres and was very, very reliable. The old Bedford truck that was at Mount White, I used that to cart the wool in and out of Mount White, and it was a very reliable machine. This shows me loading wool at the Cass railway station about 50 years ago into an LA wagon. The LA wagon held 24 bales of wool, and it was railed from there down to Timaru. Mount White then bought a bigger, better truck that would hold more bales of wool, and so they had that for a while. But then as time wore on, the transport people arrived, and this truck and trailer could carry in excess of 140 bales of wool in one foul swoop. The old Mount White Bridge, which was constructed in about 1884, had had its day, and the maintenance cost was too great, and so it was decided to build a new one. This shows a picture of a tractor bringing the trailer load of wool over, which would then meet up with the truck on the main north road, the main west road, and then it would cart the wool away instead of carting bits and pieces in the railway. In the early 70s it was decided, because of the condition of the old bridge, to build a new one. So the contractor set about, they diverted the Waimak River, they put little bailey type bridges over it to let people get in and out when they could, and they constructed this nice steel bridge across the river. First they did one side, and then they diverted the water back to the other side when that side was finished, and eventually they got the abutments in and the two sides and joined it up. Lovely steel base here for the bridge, strong, take all the weight and everything else. And finally, it shows a picture here of the new bridge finished and constructed in about the early 1970s. This shows a little bit of water in the Waimak. The Waimak could come up at a drop of a hat, and although there's not much water in there, the new bridge, with its firm construction, would withstand anything along those lines. Finally, we have a very nice picture of the new bridge, Mount White Bridge, spanning the Waimak, and hopefully it'll still be there in 100 years' time, as was the old one.